All right, ready to dive in. Today we're tackling something that's been hitting everyone's wallets lately, at least in Quebec. That's right, the rising cost of orange juice. I swear, my morning glass seems pricier every time I buy it.
Oh, yeah, you're not imagining things. It's definitely more expensive, and the reasons why, well, they're a bit more complicated than you might think at first. We're going to peel back the layers and uncover how we got to this point. It's quite a journey.
So, to get to the bottom of this OJ mystery, I actually enlisted the help of my AI assistant, Grok. And get this, the trail led us all the way back to former Prime Minister John Turner. Remember him? He was strongly opposed to free trade with the US, especially back in the 80s. What was the big wordy there?
Well, you see, Turner was really concerned that Canada would become too dependent on the US economically if we had these close trade ties. It's almost like imagine a seesaw, right? If one side is suddenly way heavier, the other side loses its freedom to move. That's kind of how he saw the potential power imbalance between the two economies.
Ooh, I like that analogy. So he was basically worried about the US calling all the shots and influencing what Canada does.
Exactly. And he was also worried about the impact on Canadian culture and identity. He feared it could lead to, kind of Americanization of Canada. It was a big debate back then.
Wow, I never thought of it that way. I just assumed free trade was about getting cheaper stuff. So, how did Canada and the US actually end up with a trade agreement despite all these concerns?
Well, despite Turner's opposition, the first Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, or CSFTA for short, was signed in 1988. Its main goal was to reduce tariffs. Imagine tariffs as like a toll booth on a trade highway. They make goods more expensive when they cross the border, right? CSFTA was all about removing those booths to make trading smoother and cheaper.
Makes sense. So that's CUSFTA, but then there's also NAFTA, right? Was that just the fancier name for the same thing?
Not quite. NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement, came about in 1994, and it expanded the free trade zone to include Mexico. So now it was a three-way deal, creating a massive North American market.
A true North American powerhouse. But then we also hear about the USMCA. Are all these trade agreements basically the same?
Well, the goal is generally the same, to make trade easier, but they've definitely changed over time. The USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, actually replaced NAFTA in 2020. It reflects how the world's changed. For example, digital trade is a big part of the USMCA now. That wasn't even a thing back in the CUSFTA days.
Makes sense, the internet has changed pretty much everything. But hold on, how does all this trade agreement history connect back to my expensive orange juice?
Well, that's where things get interesting. Remember how John Turner was worried about U.S. dominance? Well, you could say his fears kind of echo in the recent trade tensions between the two countries. Remember Donald Trump and all those tariffs?
Oh, yeah, the tariff turmoil. It seemed like every day there was a new headline about trade wars and the economy being in trouble. What did Trump actually do, and how did Canada react?
Well, in 2018, Trump decided to impose a 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum, claiming it was a national security issue. Basically, that meant Canadian steel and aluminum would suddenly become way more expensive in the U.S.
Wait, so even though we had this USMCA agreement in place, Trump could just impose tariffs like that. Didn't it protect us?
It's complicated, really. The USMCA framework was still there, but tariffs are kind of a powerful tool countries can use to protect their own industries or, to gain some leverage in negotiations.
So almost like a loophole in the agreement.
You could see it that way, yeah. And Canada wasn't just going to sit back and do nothing. Prime Minister Trudeau retaliated with counter tariffs on a bunch of U.S. goods, and guess what was on that list?
Orange juice. I knew it.
You got it. It's all connected. So, because of this trade war, U.S. orange juice suddenly became more expensive for Canadian importers, and that cost, of course, gets passed down to us at the grocery store.
Okay, now we're getting to the heart of the matter. But before we get too deep into that, let's quickly explain what a tariff actually is for our listeners who might not be familiar with the term.
Sure, great idea. It's simple, really. Imagine you're bringing a souvenir back from vacation. When you go through customs, they might make you pay a fee on that item, right? That's basically a tariff. It's a tax on goods that are imported from another country.
Ah, so like a border tax that makes those imported goods pricier. Why would a country want to do that?
Well, there are a few reasons. Sometimes it's to protect their own industries from foreign competition. By making those imported goods more expensive, it gives local companies a bit of an advantage. Other times, it's a way for the government to make some extra money. And sometimes, it's used as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations, like what happened between Canada and the US.
Interesting. Okay, I think that's a good place to pause for now. We've set the stage for this orange juice drama, but there's still so much to uncover. Join us for part 2, where we'll delve into Trump's demands and explore how this trade war has played out. It's gonna get juicy. Welcome back. Last time, we left off with Trump imposing tariffs on Canadian goods and Canada retaliating with counter tariffs on US products, including our favorite breakfast beverage, orange juice. It felt like a full-blown trade war, right? So what was Trump's game plan? What was he really hoping to achieve?
Well, it wasn't like he had a neatly typed out list of demands. Trump's objectives were kind of all over the place, statements here, actions there, even some tweets thrown in for good measure. But we can definitely piece together some of his main priorities.
All right, let's try to crack the code of the Trump playbook. What were some of the things he was focused on?
One of his big talking points was defense spending. He kept saying that Canada wasn't spending enough on defense, not meeting that NATO target of 2% of GDP.
Yes, the NATO debate. I remember that coming up a lot. So basically, Trump was saying, hey, if you want to trade with us, you got to put more money into defense.
That was definitely part of his message. He saw it as a fairness issue. He felt like the U.S. was carrying too much of the weight for NATO, and everyone else needed to step up.
But Canada was contributing troops and resources to NATO missions, right? Didn't that count for something?
Of course. And Canada's argument was that their contributions went beyond just money. It was about personnel and commitment. But for Trump, that 2% target was like a symbolic line in the sand.
Interesting. So how would increasing defense spending affect people here in Quebec? Would it mean less money for other programs or higher taxes?
That's a tough one. It really depends on how the Canadian government would choose to balance the budget, right? But it was definitely controversial. Some people argued that more money for defense would mean cuts to things like social programs or infrastructure.
I see. Okay, so defense spending was one thing. What else was Trump pushing for?
Another issue that really bothered him was the U.S. trade deficit with Canada. He complained a lot about how the U.S. was buying more from Canada than it was selling, which creates that trade deficit.
Hold on, can you break down what a trade deficit actually means? I hear that term all the time, but I'm not always sure I understand it.
Sure, it's pretty simple. Think about your own finances, right? If you spend more money than you earn, you end up with a deficit. It's the same for a country. If they import more stuff than they export, they have a trade deficit.
Okay, got it. So Trump wanted Canada to buy more American products to even things out.
Exactly. He saw that trade deficit as proof that the trading relationship wasn't balanced or fair.
But isn't trade supposed to be about each country specializing in what they're good at? If Canada produces certain goods more efficiently, shouldn't the U.S. benefit from that? Trying to force things to be equal seems like it could actually hurt both economies.
You make a good point, and a lot of economists would agree with you. But Trump had a different view. He was more focused on this idea of, winning in trade. He saw it as a zero-sum game, where if one country wins, the other has to lose.
Interesting. Okay, so defense spending and the trade deficit were two big things for Trump. Anything else on his agenda?
Yeah, he also made some comments about the U.S. not needing Canadian oil and gas.
Really? I thought Canada was a major energy supplier to the U.S.
Oh, it is. But Trump's rhetoric suggested that he wanted the U.S. to be totally energy independent, relying on its own resources, not anyone else's, even Canada's.
So even though he didn't explicitly say it, energy was part of these trade negotiations too.
It's hard to know for sure what was going on in his head, but yeah, it's definitely possible. His statements about energy independence could have been a way to pressure Canada, to give the U.S. better deals on oil and gas.
Wow, this is getting more complicated by the minute. It's amazing how the price of orange juice here in Quebec is connected to this whole web of trade politics and global power play. It's like a political thriller playing out on our breakfast tables.
Exactly. It shows how events on the world stage can have real consequences for ordinary people, right down to the cost of our groceries.
Okay, we've explored some of Trump's demands, but now let's bring it back down to earth, to the perspective of the everyday consumer. I'm sitting here in Quebec, drinking my increasingly expensive orange juice, and wondering, is there anything I can do about it?
That's a great question, and honestly, it's one a lot of people are asking. As an individual, it can feel like you have very little power to influence these massive trade disputes.
So are we just supposed to accept the higher prices and move on? That's not a very satisfying answer.
Well, it's not quite that bleak. You might not be able to single-handedly stop a trade war, but there are things you can do.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give me some hope. What can I do to fight back against overpriced OJ?
First of all, being informed, understanding the issues, that's huge. That's why these deep dives are so important.
Knowledge is power, right. But beyond just being aware of the problem, what concrete actions can I take?
You have the power as a consumer, You can choose to buy locally sourced products whenever you can, or maybe explore other beverages that aren't caught up in these tariff battles.
So, voting with my wallet, supporting local businesses, maybe cutting back on orange juice a bit.
Exactly. It might seem like a small thing, but if enough people make those choices, it sends a powerful message to businesses and politicians. It tells them that consumers are paying attention and willing to change their habits.
Okay, that's encouraging. At least it feels like I have some control over the situation. But what about solutions on a larger scale? How can we actually resolve this trade war and get orange juice prices back to normal?
Well, ultimately, it comes down to negotiation and compromise. Both sides have to be willing to sit down, listen to each other, and find some common ground.
That sounds easier said than done, right? These negotiations can go on forever, and in the meantime, consumers are the ones stuck paying the price. Literally.
You're not wrong. It's a complex process, and there's no guarantee of a quick or easy fix.
So is there any hope this will get resolved soon, or are we doomed to overpriced OJ for the foreseeable future?
It's impossible to say for sure how long these things will take. But history shows that even the most difficult trade disputes can eventually be resolved, through diplomacy and negotiation.
Fingers crossed. But let's imagine just for a second that these tensions continue. What happens then? What does the future hold for orange juice in Quebec? Are we destined to become a province of people who can barely afford their morning OJ?
That's an interesting question. And actually, some people think this trade war could be a catalyst for change, in a good way. They argue that it might push Quebec to develop its own, more resilient, locally sourced orange juice industry.
Wait, locally sourced orange juice in Quebec? Is that even possible? We're not exactly known for our citrus groves, are we?
True, it might not be the most obvious solution. But some people believe that with some innovation and investment, Quebec could find other sources of citrus fruits, maybe from other parts of Canada or even different countries altogether.
I never thought of it that way. So instead of relying solely on Florida oranges, we could have multiple sources, a more stable supply chain.
Exactly. And some folks even suggest that Quebec could invest in research and development, explore new technologies for growing citrus fruits in controlled environments like greenhouses.
Whoa, that sounds futuristic. Growing oranges in greenhouses right here in Quebec. But hey, if this trade war forces us to get creative, maybe it's not a bad thing. Maybe it's an opportunity in disguise.
That's a great way to look at it. This situation definitely highlights the risks of relying on just one source for something. Diversifying our sources, whether through local production or trade agreements with other countries, could be a valuable lesson we learn from all of this.
So maybe this trade war is a chance for Quebec to rethink its relationship with orange juice, break free from dependence on U.S. imports, and explore new, innovative ways to get our citrus fix.
Perhaps. It's a really thought-provoking idea, and it leads us to another interesting question. What if, instead of just trying to copy traditional orange juice, we explored entirely new ways to get our vitamin C and that citrusy flavor we love?
Okay, now you've got me intrigued. Tell me more. What are you picturing?
Well, imagine Quebec becoming a hub for developing completely new citrus fruit varieties, ones that could actually thrive in our climate. Imagine local citrus fruits that are not only delicious, but packed with nutrients and unique flavors you wouldn't find anywhere else.
Now that's thinking outside the box. I love the idea of turning this challenge into a chance for innovation and creativity right here in Quebec's food and beverage industry.
It's definitely a possibility worth exploring. This whole situation could be the push we need to create more sustainable, locally sourced, and maybe even tastier ways to enjoy our daily dose of citrus.
Well, listeners, that wraps up part 2 of our deep dive. We've uncovered Trump's demands, explored the consumer's perspective, and even imagined a future where Quebec is a citrus innovator. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll wrap up with some final thoughts and leave you with a provocative question to ponder as you sip your next glass of orange juice, no matter the price. And we're back for the final squeeze of our deep dive into Quebec's orange juice saga. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? From trade wars and tariffs to the possibility of homegrown Quebec oranges. Who knew there was so much going on behind that simple glass of OJ?
It really does show you how interconnected everything is. The decision in Washington or a tweet from, well, you know who, can end up affecting what you pay for your breakfast here in Quebec. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a wild ride for sure. But before we get too carried away with dreams of orange groves in Quebec, let's take stock of what we've learned. What are the big takeaways from this deep dive?
Well, one thing that really stands out is how important it is to understand the global picture. We can't just focus on what's happening here. We need to be aware of international events, trade deals, all of it. Even the personalities of world leaders. They can impact our lives in unexpected ways.
It's true, kind of like that butterfly effect, right? A butterfly flaps its wings on one side of the world and it causes a hurricane on the other. Except in this case, it's more like a tweet causing a price hike on orange juice in Quebec.
That's a perfect analogy. This whole situation also really highlights how risky it can be to rely too heavily on just one source for a product, any product really.
You mean like how Canada has been so dependent on the US for its orange juice?
Exactly. If that source suddenly becomes unreliable because of political disagreements, natural disasters, whatever it might be, the whole system gets disrupted, right? Prices go up, there might be shortages, maybe you can't even get the product at all.
So diversification is key, right? Finding new trading partners, developing our own sources, maybe even coming up with brand new products that can fill the gap. The more options we have, the better.
Exactly. It's all about building a more resilient system, one that can handle shocks and disruptions. And this applies to everything, not just orange juice. Think about our energy sources, food supply, all kinds of things.
That's a really good point. This whole conversation has made me realize how important it is to be a more conscious consumer, to think about where my food comes from, the impact of my choices, and how I can support local businesses and sustainable practices.
That's the silver lining in all of this, isn't it? Sometimes these challenges force us to be more aware, to innovate, and ultimately to make positive changes.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture lessons, but let's bring it back to our listeners in Quebec. What can they do right now to navigate this orange juice situation?
Well, like we mentioned earlier, they have power as consumers. They can choose to buy locally produced goods, explore different beverages, things like that. It all makes a difference.
So instead of automatically grabbing that carton of orange juice, maybe they could try a locally made apple cider or whip up a smoothie with some Quebec-grown berries.
Exactly. It's about being open to new possibilities and supporting those local businesses whenever possible. Who knows, they might even discover a new favorite drink.
And of course, let's not forget the importance of staying informed and engaged. Deep dives like this one are a great way to understand these complex issues, so you can make more informed choices.
Couldn't agree more. Knowledge is power. The more we understand about the forces that shape our world, the better equipped we are to navigate them.
Well said. Okay, before we wrap up this citrus-infused journey, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought, something to chew on.
Ooh, I love a good challenge. Hit me with it.
All right, here it is. We've been talking about the possibility of Quebec having its own orange juice industry, maybe even growing oranges in these high-tech greenhouses. But what if we went even further? What if we stopped trying to just replicate traditional orange juice and embraced a whole new vision of citrus?
Okay, now you've got my attention. What are you thinking?
Imagine Quebec becoming a center for creating new types of citrus fruits, hybrids that are perfectly suited to our climate. Imagine local citrus that's not only delicious, but packed with unique nutrients and flavors you wouldn't find anywhere else.
So that's an exciting thought. Think of what chefs could do with those new varieties. New dishes, new cocktails. Quebec could really showcase its creativity and agricultural innovation.
Exactly. It could be a game changer, not just for orange juice, but for the whole food and beverage scene in Quebec.
It's a bold idea for sure. But who knows? Maybe this trade war, with all its challenges, might be the thing that sparks this citrus revolution.
Maybe it'll force us to think differently, to move beyond those traditional products and embrace a future of delicious, sustainable, locally sourced citrus, whatever form it might take.
Now that's a future worth toasting to.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the possibilities. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the surprisingly complex world of orange juice economics. Stay curious, everyone, and we'll catch you on our next adventure.